Thank you, Stephen. Wow. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are we doing tonight? Doing well? Well, to be recognized for doing something that I dreamed of doing as a young man, something I wrote about, as Stephen said, in my high school yearbook under career aspirations, this is just a completely humbling honor for me. I want to thank my girlfriend, Melissa, my mom, Ann, my stepdad, Charlie, for their love and continued support all over the years. I also send my deep gratitude for my colleagues at WTVR and the folks at the Virginia Association of Broadcasters. Folks, a few months ago, March 17th to be exact, I was on assignment. I found myself waiting at the end of a long gravel driveway. It's on a small rural farm in Warsaw, Virginia, in the Northern Neck. I was gathering elements for a story about an elderly man who had been looking for something. He'd been looking for this for 25 years. After waiting a couple of hours, an SUV with Maryland tags kicked up the gravel, turned the corner, and slowly came down the driveway. When it finally stopped, I noticed this anxious, frail old man, Don Parthry, sitting in the passenger side seat. With help from his family, his daughters, stepson, the nearly 80-year-old climbed out of the passenger side seat, clutched his walker, and Mr. Parthry could not contain his childlike excitement. He made a beeline for the barn at the farm. Don had been praying for this one moment for a quarter of a century, 25 years. Inside the barn, sitting on this rickety old table, was a wooden military footlocker that belonged to his father, a decorated war pilot, Colonel Clyde Parthry. The aging but sturdy box that I had seen right there was found in a dumpster, just seconds, folks, from being gobbled up and crushed by a hungry trash compactor. How did it get there? Well, apparently, after Colonel Parthry's death, the footlocker was passed down to other family members and more family members and pretty much was forgotten and ultimately tossed in the garbage. But Don Parthry, that 80-year-old man, never forgot about that footlocker, his father's footlocker. All along, he thought this precious artifact was lost to history until the strangers who found the footlocker in that garbage contacted and found Don in Maryland. But when Don opened the footlocker for the first time, he shut it immediately, dropped his head, tried to catch his breath. Inside the locker, his father's personal belongings, like his military hat, his passport, piles of family photographs, even his parents' marriage license from the 1920s. Also, in that footlocker was the American flag draped over Colonel Parthry's casket in 1966. To watch Don, this 80-year-old man, clutch and hold that American flag in his arms and not let go, and weep openly in front of us all, something this reporter will always remember. Fast forward a few weeks from that story, I was asked to teach a class about storytelling at Virginia Commonwealth University. I showed the students this incredible, emotional story about Don Parthry's reunion with his father's footlocker. After the story ended, silence enveloped the room. After a few moments, a young woman was wiping tears from her eyes, and she broke the silence. And she said, "I didn't know journalism could do that. I didn't know journalism could do that." That line stuck with me. Will always stick with me. I didn't know journalism could do that. Do you know who did know journalism could do that more? Most men and women in our community, in our profession. That man whose name is engraved on this incredible award, the late George A. Bowles, Jr. I stood in stunned silence a couple of weeks ago when I learned that the Virginia Association of Broadcasters was honoring me with this prestigious award. Now, I must admit, I never knew who Mr. Bowles was, and was, unfortunately, never had the pleasure of hearing his reports on our airwaves. But I was determined to find out who he was from the people that knew him and worked with him. I wanted to know what made George Bowles tick. I'd feel uncomfortable standing before you tonight talking about myself without paying homage to Mr. Bowles. A former colleague of Mr. Bowles, Jeb Hochman, a friend of mine, shared with me the other day that George was, quote, a super journalist and did radio segments similar to the great TV segments that you now create, Greg. He left a lasting impression, Greg. Jeb said, quote, I miss those commentaries, but then you have picked up the mantle and are doing them on TV. He would have liked and respected you, Greg. That rocked my world. The late George Bowles Jr. was a Virginian through and through. He was born on March 9th, 1925, in the family home that he loved so much. It was called the Oaks. It's a brick 19th century home sitting on the rolling hills in a little town called Kent Store on the Goochland and Fluvanna line. And I mean literally, it is on the line. Fittingly, the Bowles home is just a couple of miles from the geographic center of our great Commonwealth, because as we would soon find out, George relished being in the middle of the action as a journalist. George served in both World War II and the war in Korea. He worked his way up from a buck private to lieutenant colonel. Over the course of 30 years, he was stationed everywhere from Colorado to Korea to Georgia to Germany. But his heart forever remained right here in Virginia. So much so that George, I kid you not, had the Richmond Times-Dispatch delivered to him in stacks when he was stationed in Germany. So who says no one's interested in yesterday's newspaper? George certainly was. After retiring from the military in 1971, George just dove headfirst into our awesome profession. He launched his stellar career in journalism with gusto. Listen to this. George eventually wrote columns for 25 newspapers and was broadcasting on 50 stations. He was, one friend once wrote, the voice of Virginia. How about that? Having that, the voice of Virginia. Yes. Richmond Times-Dispatch political reporter and columnist Jeff Shapiro told me the other day he remembers Mr. Bowles writing his stories on a folding card table in the bowels of the state capitol. Jeff Shapiro said George was older and wiser, and Jeff says the politicians across the state, wherever he was, respected George deeply. Jeff recalls fondly that Mr. Bowles wore a crushed tweed hat and sucked on his ever-present pipe. Jeff tells me he was fatherly, affable, and keen sense of history. He also enjoyed telling a good story and had this bellowing laugh and, quote, a sing-songy voice in a broadcasty way, as only Jeff Shapiro, if you know him, could say. In addition to Jeff Shapiro, Professor Larry Sabato with UVA, University of Virginia, shared with me that people like George do not grow on trees, Greg. He was a one-of-a-kind with a marvelous sense of humor. A Virginia original, Greg, no one was better. Mr. Sabato says that George's column on Virginia politics was a must-read, and his radio reports were classics. His enthusiasm and excitement came across on that medium, Greg. Sabato says he wishes he could still hear that booming voice again and watch him right at the Capitol, smoking that pipe to give inspiration. In addition to covering the political beat, Mr. Bowles liked to crisscross the Commonwealth, letting his curiosity lead the way. He had an uncanny ability to unearth many stories that most journalists would overlook. George, as a friend once wrote, found the most interesting stories about most interesting people in nooks and crannies while inviting his listeners along for the ride in his radio reports. George's stories covered a wide array, everything from the evolution and creativity of Richmond-born dancer Bill Bojangles Robinson and the courage of former slave-turned-educator Booker T. Washington, to Wilmer McLean, who had an interesting story in history. He was a peace-loving pacifist who saw the American Civil War begin and end in his front yard, first in Manassas and lastly in Appomattox. Those are the types of stories that George told. George eventually turned his radio ports into his first book. This one, right here, called Pages from the Virginia Story. It's a fascinating, fascinating collection of many of George's dispatches and radio reports. It's come out in 1979. Now, I felt at this point in talking to Jeb and Jeff and Larry Sabato at UVA that I was learning who George was as a professional. But I wanted to get to know George on a deeper level. You can imagine my surprise when I learned that Mrs. Bowles is still living. I reached Mrs. Nancy Bowles by phone, and she invited me to the Bowles family home, the Oaks, that same house that George was born in 92 years ago. Mrs. Bowles led me around the ancient brick home that George loves so much. You can almost feel George's presence when you're walking the halls, folks, especially with this massive portrait of Mr. Bowles hanging in the parlor. And I fully expected Mr. Bowles to come walking around the corner and greet me. As Nancy and I sat in the dining room table sipping chilled sweet tea with fresh mint, the 86-year-old Mrs. Bowles recounted with great joy and great clarity how her beloved husband cherished reading in his favorite chair after work or writing into the small hours of the night. His bedroom also served as his office, so needless to say, Nancy spent many a sleepless night listening to George clack away feverishly on the keys of his typewriter. All while a thick, distinct cloud of pipe smoke hung over his head, Mrs. Bowles said he was always chomping on that pipe. It was his trademark, his signature, and she said it had this calming effect. In fact, Mrs. Bowles gave me one of Mr. Bowles' pipe for inspiration while I wrote this speech. Yeah. And I got to tell you, folks, even after 31 years of his passing, you can still detect the sweet smell of George's pipe tobacco inside. And if you'd like to hold it or take a whiff, I'm just sitting right over here, I'll have it. It's great inspiration, folks, let me tell you. I've held this for a long time in the last couple of weeks. Mrs. Bowles said her husband was gregarious and enjoyed meeting new people. The tireless worker also liked to share wisdom and his ways with young buck reporters, and she said he was proud of what he did. Journalism, Mrs. Bowles says, was his heart and soul. George left us too soon, folks. Exactly 61 years to the day after he was born, George died from a heart condition at the Oaks on March 9th, 1986. He died in the same room on his birthday, same room he came into this world back in 1925. How about that for symmetry? Near the end of my visit with Nancy, she led me across the street of this quiet country road in front of the Oaks to a small family cemetery lined with weathered gravestones. You could barely read the dates that stretched back to the late 1700s and early 1800s. There, among the generations of other Bowles, we came across the final resting place of George Bowles, Jr. Chiseled on the giant of a man's unassuming headstone were four simple words: genteel, generous, noble, and free. Over the last few weeks, I finally got to know who George Bowles really was. And I do wish from the bottom of my heart, folks, that I had the pleasure of meeting him and have the sheer joy of listening to George work his magic on the radio. As I was leaving, I shared with Mrs. Bowles that if I could be half the patriot, half the journalist, and half the man as her husband, I would consider my life and career a success. I will forever, forever carry the honor of this award and a little piece of George on assignment in the nooks and crannies of Virginia. Remember, folks, journalism can do that. George Bowles did. Good night.